She had restored Mrs. Maldon to her bed and to some of her dignity, but the horrid symptoms were not thereby abated. The inhuman noises and the distressing, incomprehensible appeal had continued. Immediately Rachel's back was turned, Mrs. Maldon had fallen out of bed. This happened 3 times, so that clearly the sufferer was falling out of bed under the urgency of some half-conscious purpose. Rachel had soothed her, and once she had managed to say with some clearness the words, "I've been downstairs." But when Rachel went back to the room from dispatching Louis for the doctor, she was again on the floor. Louis's absence from the house had lasted an intolerable age, but the doctor had followed closely on the messenger, and already the symptoms had become a little less acute. The doctor had diagnosed with rapidity. Supervening upon her ordinary cardiac attack after supper, Mrs. Maldon had had in the night an embolus in one artery of the brain. The way in which the doctor announced the fact showed to Rachel that nothing could easily have been more serious. And yet the mere naming of the affliction eased her, although she had no conception of what an embolus might be. Dr. Yardley had remained until 4 o'clock, when Mrs. Maldon, surprisingly convalescent, dropped off to sleep. He remarked that she might recover. At 8 o'clock he had come back. Mrs. Maldon was awake, but had apparently no proper recollection of the events of the night, which even to Rachel had begun to seem unreal, like a waning hallucination. The doctor gave orders with optimism, and left, sufficiently reassured to allow himself to yawn. At 8:15 Louis had departed to his own affairs, on Rachel's direct suggestion. And when Mrs. Tarns had been informed of the case so full of disturbing enigmas, while Rachel and she drank tea together in the kitchen, the daily domestic movement of the house was partly resumed, from vanity, because Rachel could not bear to sit idle, nor to admit to herself that she had been scared to a standstill. And now Mrs. Maldon, in full possession of her faculties, faced Thomas Batchgrew for the interview which she had insisted on having, and Rachel waited with an uncanny apprehension, her ears full of the mysterious and frightful phrase, "I've lost all that money." III. Mrs. Maldon, after a few words had passed as to her illness, used exactly the same phrase again. "I've lost all that money." Mr. Batchgrew snorted and glanced at Rachel for an explanation. "Yes, it's all gone," proceeded Mrs. Maldon with calm resignation. "But I'm too old to worry. Please listen to me. We lost my serviette and ring last evening at supper, couldn't find it anywhere, and in the night it suddenly occurred to me where it was. I've remembered everything now, almost, and I'm quite sure. You know you first told me to put the money in the wardrobe. Now, before you said that, I had thought of putting it on the top of the cupboard to the right of the fireplace in the back room downstairs. I thought that would be a good place for it in case burglars did come. No burglar would ever think of looking there." "God bless me!" Mr. Batchgrew muttered, scornfully protesting. "It couldn't possibly be seen, you see. However, I thought I ought to respect your wish, and so I decided I'd put part of it on the top of the cupboard, and part of it underneath a lot of linen at the bottom of the drawer in my wardrobe. That would satisfy both of us." "Would it?" exclaimed Mr. Batchgrew, without any restraint upon his heavy rolling voice. "Well, I must have picked up the serviette and ring with the banknotes, you see. I fear I'm absent-minded like that sometimes. I know I went out of the sitting room with both hands full. I know both hands were occupied because I remember when I went into the back room I didn't turn the gas up, and I pushed a chair up to the cupboard with my knee for me to stand on. I'm certain I put some of the notes on the top of the cupboard. Then I came upstairs. The window on the landing was rattling, and I put the other part of the money on the chair while I tried to fasten the window. However, I couldn't fasten it, so I left it. And then I thought I picked up the money again off the chair, and came in here, and hid it at the bottom of the drawer, and locked the wardrobe." "You thought," said Thomas Batchgrew, gazing at the aged weakling as at an insane criminal. "Was this just after I left?" Mrs. Maldon nodded apologetically. "When I woke up the first time in the night, it struck me like a flash. Had I taken the serviette and ring up with the notes? I am liable to do that sort of thing. I'm an old woman. It's no use denying it." She looked plaintively at Rachel, and her voice trembled. "I got up. I was bound to get up, and I turned the gas on, and there the serviette and ring were at the bottom of the drawer, but no money. I took everything out of the drawer, piece by piece, and put it back again. I simply cannot tell you how I felt. I went out to the landing with a match. There was no money there. And then I went downstairs in the dark. I never knew it to be so dark, in spite of the street lamp. I knocked against the clock. I nearly knocked it over. I managed to light the gas in the back room. I made sure that I must have left all the notes on the top of the cupboard instead of only part of them. But there was nothing there at all. Nothing. Then I looked all over the sitting room floor with a candle. When I got upstairs again, I didn't know what I was doing. I knew I was going to be ill, and I just managed to ring the bell for dear Rachel, and the next thing I remember was I was in bed here, and Rachel putting something hot to my feet, the dear child." Her eyes glistened with tears. And Rachel, too, as she pictured the enfeebled and despairing incarnation of dignity colliding with grandfather's clocks in the night, and climbing on chairs, and groping over carpets, had difficulty not to cry, and a lump rose in her throat. She was so moved by compassion that she did not at first feel the full shock of the awful disappearance of the money. Mr. Batchgrew, for the second time that morning, unequal to his situation, turned foolishly to the wardrobe, clearing his throat and snorting. "It's on one of the sliding trays," said Mrs. Maldon. "What's on one of the sliding trays?" "The serviette." Rachel, who was nearest, opened the wardrobe and immediately discovered the missing serviette and ring, which had the appearance of a direct dramatic proof of Mrs. Maldon's story. Mr. Batchgrew exclaimed, indignant, "I never heard such a rigmarole in all my born days!" And then angrily to Rachel, "Go down and look on the top of the cupboard, thee." Rachel hesitated. "I'm quite resigned," said Mrs. Maldon placidly. "It's a punishment on me for hardening my heart to Julian last night. It's a punishment for my pride." "Now then!" Mr. Batchgrew glared bullyingly at Rachel, who vanished. In a few moments she returned. "There's nothing at all on the top of the cupboard." "But the money must be somewhere," said Mr. Batchgrew savagely. £965, and I've arranged to lend out that money again at once. What am I to say to the mortgager? Am I to tell him as I've lost it? No, I never!" Mrs. Maldon murmured, "Nay, nay, it's no use looking at me. I thought I should never get over it in the night, but I'm quite resigned now." Rachel, standing near the door, could observe both Mrs. Maldon and Thomas Batchgrew, and was regarded by neither of them. And while in the convulsive commotion of her feelings her sympathy for and admiration of Mrs. Maldon became poignant, she was thrilled by the most intense scorn and disgust for Thomas Batchgrew. The chief reason for her abhorrence was the old man's insensibility to the angelic submission, the touching fragility, the heavenly meekness and tranquillity of Mrs. Maldon, as she lay there helpless, victimized by a paralytic affliction. Rachel wanted to forget utterly the souvenir of Mrs. Maldon's paroxysm in the night, because it slurred the unmatched dignity of the aged creature. Another reason was the mere fact that Mr. Batchgrew had insisted on leaving the money in the house. Who but Mr. Batchgrew would have had the notion of saddling poor old Mrs. Maldon with the custody of a vast sum of money? It was a shame. It was positively cruel. Rachel was indignantly convinced that he alone ought to be made responsible for the money. And lastly, she loathed and condemned him for the reason that he was so obviously unequal to the situation. He could not handle it. He was found out. He was disproved. He did not know what to do. He could only mouth, strut, bully, and make rude noises. He could not even keep decently around him the cloak of self-importance. He stood revealed to Mrs. Maldon and Rachel, as he had sometimes stood revealed to his dead wife, and to his elder children, and to some of his confidential, faithful employees. He was an offence in the delicacy of the bedroom. If the rancour of Rachel's judgment had been fierce enough to strike him to the floor, assuredly his years would not have saved him. And yet Mrs. Maldon gazed at him with submissive and apologetic gentleness. Foolish saint! Fancy her, thought Rachel, hardening her heart to Julian. Rachel longed to stiffen her with some backing of her own harsh common sense. And her affection for Mrs. Maldon grew passionate and half maternal. IV. Thomas Batchgrew was saying, "It beats me how anybody in their senses could pick up a serviette and put it way for a pile of banknotes." He scowled. "However, I'll go and see Snow. I'll see what Snow says. I'll get him to come up with one of his best men, Dixon, perhaps." "Thomas Batchgrew!" cried Mrs. Maldon with sudden, disturbing, febrile excitement. "You'll do no such thing. I'll have no police prying into this affair. If you do that, I shall just die right off." And her manner grew so imperious that Mr. Batchgrew was intimidated. But, I'd sooner lose all the money," said Mrs. Maldon, almost wildly. She blushed, and Rachel also felt herself to be blushing, and was not sure whether she knew why she was blushing. An atmosphere of constraint and shame seemed to permeate the room. Mr. Batchgrew growled, "The money must be in the house. The truth is, Elizabeth, ye don't know no more than that bedpost where ye put it." And Rachel agreed eagerly, "Of course it must be in the house. I shall set to and turn everything out, everything." "Ye'd better," said Thomas Batchgrew. "That will be the best thing, dear, perhaps," said Mrs. Maldon, indifferent, and now plainly fatigued. Everyone seemed determined to be convinced that the money was in the house, and to employ this conviction as a defence against horrible dim suspicions that had inexplicably emerged from the corners of the room and were creeping about like menaces. "Where else should it be?" muttered Batchgrew sarcastically, after a pause, as if to say, anybody who fancies the money isn't in the house is an utter fool. Mrs. Maldon had closed her eyes. There was a faint knock at the door. Rachel turned instinctively to prevent a possible intruder from entering and catching sight of those dim suspicions before they could be driven back into their dark corner. Then she remembered that she had asked Mrs. Tarns to bring up some Revalenta Arabica food for Mrs. Maldon as soon as it should be ready, and she sedately opened the door. Mrs. Tarns, with her usual serf-like diffidence, remained invisible except for the hand holding forth the cup; but her soft voice, charged with sensational news, was heard "Mrs.